This episode is brought to you by The Skeptical Buddha, The Tao of Science, my book, which is a thoughtful discourse on Eastern philosophy and how it helped birth ideas required for science and skepticism and the way it fell behind in the face of new evidence. This book discusses the long history of both philosophies as well as the tenets and variations within the varying sects, along with psychology and our own natural biases. It discusses how to counter our natural biases using science and the underlying concepts of meditation and mindfulness, a more complex understanding of how science operates than most of the public understands, and why it is the best tool we have to discover truth and reality, as well as philosophical ideas we might embrace as technology progresses. The material is packaged in a way that the average person can understand, with rich illustrations to draw the reader in and feel at peace. Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. The United States military is the most expensive military on the planet. At the moment, it spends more than the next 9 militaries combined, and that has gone down from 10 since more nations are ramping up their militaries. We spent $778 billion every year as of last year on our military, and few in Congress from either side questioned it. It's a job creator, as the military-industrial complex planned it. Much of the money is unaccounted for, and every year they move the audit date up, because it's that much of a mess, and money leaks from the military like a sieve. In my opinion, however, not all of this is bad. As a defense and deterrent, what we spend on the military is pretty amazing and prevents people from trying to mess with us. Being able to be untouchable in defense and short-term interventions is actually the best thing possible. The U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force are both great as deterrents and short-range strikes. The Marines will hate me for this, but they are part of the Navy. Their jobs are to be a show of force, to deter people from attacking us or allies, and if we need to, do quick, short-term strikes. The Navy is in the U.S. Constitution, and the Air Force also helps in a similar role, to defend the homeland. We should still lead the world in weapons manufacturing, with these two branches, which is a powerful leveraging tool when it comes to requiring our help with parts and maintenance if they buy our equipment. However, there are two areas we could cut drastically that would not only put money back into our pockets or public spending, like Social Security, that are being purposely starved. The first is the fact that the military is required to do way too much. Diplomacy, cybersecurity, intelligence, soft power, science research through DARPA, humanitarian aid, just like how many in the defund the police movement argue. All of these could and should be taken off the plate of the military and given back with the funding back to the programs that they should be in, and start a science and humanitarian industrial complex that young people can enter instead of the war machine for service to get them training and other benefits. As I mentioned in my video, we need a science industrial complex. And as Bo, the fifth column, put it, the U.S. needs to switch from being the world's police force to the world's EMT. The Brookings Institute has suggested forms of mandatory service of any kind could help dissolve the national divide, pushing people from different parts of the country to serve together. And next, we really need to dissolve the U.S. Army. The Army is built for one thing once you strip all the other stuff I mentioned, and that is, unless you're having a long-term land war like World War II, it exists simply to invade and hold a long-term occupation. Otherwise, it has no other use, and if you have one, as the founders knew, the government would go to war so much easier. They heavily dislike the idea of a standing army, hence the Second Amendment. For most of the U.S., the early army either didn't exist, or it existed only on paper for the most part until the War of 1812 when we invaded Canada. Next, the army was used to remove native peoples from their land and fight them. After that, the army was used to invade Mexican territory and steal it. Then it fought the Civil War, and for a brief period stayed in the South to enforce Reconstruction until President Hayes pulled them out and abandoned the newly freed slaves to Jim Crow. Then, for the rest of the century, it was just used to suppress and abuse natives even more. While the other branches have some heroic and humanitarian histories, for the first half of its existence outside of the Civil War, the U.S. Army was nothing but a brutal thieving force. Then they were used to occupy the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico, often brutally after the Spanish-American War. So up until World War I, they were also brutes, making the rich money through war profiteering, as General Smedley Butler showed to be blatantly clear in his work, War is a Racket. We probably never should have gone into World War I, but we did, expanding it to its biggest size ever. And then after that, the army shrank again significantly. After Pearl Harbor, it exploded in size, and after that it shrank again, which caused a short-term recession, because we were no longer spending so much on our war, and instead Truman and Ike spent it on infrastructure projects. So far, the Civil War, Reconstruction, weakly argued World War I, which made World War II essential, were the only good things the U.S. Army accomplished. They went on and invaded Korea and then Vietnam, and just kept invading places. The other branches do have their ugly sides, but for the most part they were deterrents from wars, and it was the army being available that made their ugly sins possible. The few just interventions we got involved with had us in and out very quickly, which could have been potentially done by the Air Force and the Marines today. I'm unsure if the Air Force was up to the task at that point, though. Rwanda should have been a short intervention, but we did nothing and a genocide occurred. Then 9/11 happened and the US government got mired in a 10-year and a 20-year war that would have never ever been possible without a standing army. Get bin Laden in and out quickly using the SEALs and Marines, instead we occupied. If we need ground troops in the case of a real, just land war, we have the National Guard we could easily call up, and all the training and know-how any army needs could easily be maintained by the Marines and the National Guard. The Air Force has sufficiently replaced the need for a standing army, and we could dissolve the army. Its only purpose is to get us into unjust wars, and the few bright spots in its history makes up around 25 years out of 250. The rest just gave the government an excuse to invade people and steal their land and stuff, or make war profiteers tons out of tax money. Eliminating the army would make people no longer afraid of us invading, but they would fear shock strikes. Nations like Russia and China would fear us less, as would other nations that might consider terrorism. If we aren't going to invade and occupy them, they will be less inclined to cause acts of terrorism, and our soft power will finally go back up again as being the good guy we used to hold prior to 9/11. By eliminating the army, we would still be larger than the 6 biggest militaries combined instead of the 9 biggest. Let's disband the army, stop recruiting temporarily for all branches, let the members of the army join other branches, the National Guard, the UN Peacekeeping Army, or just quit if they prefer. Build and fund a science and humanitarian industrial complex instead to actually create stability in the world instead of destabilizing it over and over again. If we need to run an operation, it will and can only be to get in and get out quickly. Ukraine has shown that a truly just invasion of sovereign territory, weapons like drones, HIMARS, Stingers, and Javelin missiles, can be given to the defending army if we can help them get organized. Let's end the army for the good of the world. America should only have a defensive force with a fleet of EMTs, instead of an empire-building force just sitting there tempting any war-hungry politician.
So as always, thank you all for watching this as a video or listening to this as a podcast, which I'm sure was completely uncontroversial to anyone, especially to the YouTube monetization team. So if you found this useful, please donate to my Patreon. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have almost 700 videos on my channel that I've made over the past 11 years on religion, science, psychology, and politics. Please go check them out, and if your site has the option, like, rate, review, and comment. A special thanks goes out to Kendall Copperberg, Mylon Mia, Ogrel, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Joe Taylor for their $10 or more Wapawet level donations. I'm always humbled by the fact that they find my work worth funding and worth driving me forward. Thank you all. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.